John, so much for that introduction, and thank you, John, and indeed everybody at the BSA for hosting me this semester. It's been the most sort of wonderful way to spend 3 months on sabbatical, being here in Athens, being able to use the Finley collection here in the school, which has all of the books the printed books I'm going to be talking about today, and being able to use Athens as a base to go and visit sites that I will be talking about today. So it's been a wonderful, wonderful opportunity. Thank you so much to the school. Okay, so I shall begin. It's a statement of fact that the Greek revival in European architecture began in the late 18th century and truly flourished in the 19th. Here are two of its great buildings. It is also incontestable that the movement began as an intellectual proto-archaeological one. The publication of Julien David Leroy's Les Ruines du plus beau monument de la Grèce in 1758, and volume 1 of James Stewart and Nicholas Revet's The Antiquities of Athens in 1762, radically transformed the Western European conception of ancient Greek architecture, and their detailed, measured drawings of ancient buildings in Athens and beyond allowed architects to emulate ancient Greece with confidence and accuracy. As we see here, William Wilkins doing in Downing College, Cambridge in 1804, a fairly typical Greek revival building, and one that is fundamentally inspired by Stewart and Revet's engravings of the Erechtheion. These two publications, by and large, created the Greek revival and have always, correctly, in my opinion, been seen as a watershed in European architecture. However, Leroy, Stewart, and Revet were not the first Western Europeans to see the ruins of ancient Greece. They were not the first to write about them, and they were, nor indeed were they the first to publish images of them. And indeed, the Greek revival architects who followed Leroy, Stewart, and Revet were not the first to claim that they were designing Greek buildings. There had been many others before them. It's long been assumed, however, that whilst these earlier accounts of Greece and its ruins are of cultural and intellectual historical significance, they do not in any way fundamentally change how Western Europe perceived of ancient Greek architecture. These two images seem to reveal a lot, I think. On the left here, an image of the Parthenon published in 1678 by Jakob Spon in his account of his travels in Greece. To say this lacks the precision and accuracy of the images produced by Leroy, Stewart, and Revet is an exercise in stating the obvious. And no architect with the best will in the world could really use this image as an accurate source for a building. By contrast, the building on the right reflects the standards of European illustrations of Roman architecture by the late 17th century, and this is Antoine Deguet's in 1682 providing detailed measured drawings, in this case of the Theatre of Marcellus. Likewise, if we look at architectural designs that were purported to be Greek by their architects, we encounter to our eyes a confused picture. This is a design for an executed rustic garden temple made by Nicholas Hawksmoor around 1724. In the annotations, Hawksmoor tells us that this design had been inspired by his readings of Herodotus, a comfortably Greek source, alongside Pliny and Varro, almost certainly cited here as authorities on the ancient Campagna and rural life in the ancient world. And Hawksmoor also tells us that this design has Greek compartments, by which he means the details, I think. To our eyes, the details of this building look decidedly Roman, if not Italian, with apertures in the form of Venetian windows, exaggerated keystones, and a pantheon-like dome atop. This appears to have been designed by someone with little, if any, idea of what ancient Greek architecture actually looked like. To sum up then, the European understanding of ancient Greek architecture prior to Leroy and Stewart and Revet was a confused picture. And this has led architectural historians to, in general, dismiss the late 17th and early 18th century reception of ancient Greek architecture as one of ignorance and generalization. Here, for example, are two exceptionally good architectural historians and one okay one, concluding on what I've just been talking about. So Morton Crook, in his book on the Greek Revival in 1972, noted early in the book that to the 17th and 18th centuries, Grecian was usually a synonym for classical. To the 18th and early 19th centuries, often enough, Grecian simply meant Arcadian, Gradually, however, the use of a more precise nomenclature permeates downwards from the professional archaeologists. In other words, in the early 19th century, there's a moment when the Grecian becomes something different to just Arcadian. Christopher Drew Armstrong, in a fabulous book about Leroy that he published in 2012, says something reasonably similar, that although Vitruvius informed his readers that the orders originated in Greece, neither he nor any of the aforementioned authors made much effort to determine what Greek architecture actually looked like. Until the 18th century, the arts of ancient Greece and Rome were generally regarded as a uniform block. And me writing in 2013 on the subject of an English traveller called Francis Vernon, who I will discuss later, making a similar point here, the widely held notion that Greek buildings were either the fountainhead or the apogee of classical architecture would not be formulated until at least the late 18th century. There was little sense in late 17th century writings of an awareness of a development in ancient architectural style from the Greek period to the Roman. So, as the Hawksmoor drawing appears to show, and the spotlight illustration of the Parthenon could in no way refute, architects and writers prior to the 1750s did not have a clear sense that ancient Greek architecture might have been different from the Roman. And there was little sense of any stylistic chronology of ancient built form. I think that all these positions are in many respects true. But something has always bothered me about them, even when I wrote this myself a few years ago. As Drew Armstrong observes here, Vitruvius, the Roman author of architecture, who more than any other writer shaped 17th century understandings of the built fabric of the ancient world, was at least clear that the Romans owed their architectural formulation to the Greeks. And if we go back to Vitruvius, and indeed other ancient authors that the 17th century knew well, we find moments when they hint at differences between the Greek and the Roman in architecture, and suggestions even of ancient architectural chronology. So here in the first quote is Pliny discussing a widely read text in the 17th century, discussing the development of, in this case, is the development of the orders, with specific reference to the temple of Artemis at Ephesus. In ancient times, Pliny tells us a proportion was observed was that the breadth of the temple should be 3 times the height of the column. It was in the earlier temple of Diana at Ephesus that the columns were for the first time mounted on molded bases and crowned with capitals, and it was decided that the lower diameter of the columns should be 1/8 of their height, and the height of the molded bases should be 1/2 of the lower diameter, and that the lower diameter should exceed the upper diameter by 1/7. Note here Pliny's conception of an earlier way of doing something, earlier than his period, and earlier indeed than the temple of Artemis at Ephesus was as he knew it. It was a Hellenistic building by his time. And here's Vitruvius talking about bricks. Now, 3 kinds of bricks are produced, says Vitruvius. The first is called the Lydian in Greek, is the one that our people use, and it is 1.5 feet long. Greek buildings are built with the other 2 kinds, of which one is called the pendadorum, the other the tetradorum. So here's Vitruvius telling us that the ancient Greeks used different sized bricks than the Romans, which, though not particularly helpful when it comes to actually envisaging the differences between Greek and Roman buildings, does at least tell us that they were different in some way. Add to this Vitruvius's account of the origins of the orders, which very clearly took place in ancient Greece. They evolved from one another many centuries after Vitruvius was writing, and one can get a sense of some form of architectural development in the ancient world, even if, as Drew Armstrong correctly observes, the specific nature of that development was not in any way precisely communicated by the Roman author. And indeed, there were early modern authors who picked up on this, especially Vitruvius's claim that the orders of architecture of such central importance in the early modern world originated in Greece and may have in fact been perfected by the Greeks. Here's an author of the mid-16th century, Sebastiano Serlio, writing in Italy in 1550, noting that certainly anyone who has seen the wonderful works built by the Greeks, nearly all of which disappeared, demolished by time and wars, would judge that the Greek works were far better than those of the Romans. Serlio, though he had no idea what an ancient Greek building looked like, having not only never seen one, but also operating under the assumption that none of them no longer existed, still felt that they would have still been better than the surviving Roman examples that he knew so well. Indeed, this comes in the preface to a whole book on Roman ruins, his third book on architecture. This passage, of course, reveals the deep ignorance of Western European knowledge of Greece in the mid-16th century, when the borders of the Ottoman Empire remained fairly securely shut to Westerners. Fast forward 100 years, and we get a similar picture, one of a perceived Greek superiority, in spite of a contemporary ignorance of the specifics of that superiority. This is the French writer Roland Frère de Chambry, writing in 1750, although translated here into English in 1707. Frère argues throughout this text the parallel of ancient and modern architecture, that the Greeks were superior to the Romans, especially in their handling of the orders of classical architecture. And indeed, Frère separates the three orders that originated in ancient Greece, the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian, from later orders that he thought were Latin or Roman. So he says, the Greeks, who were the first inventors of them, and with whom alone they happily arrived to their supremest perfection, preserved them in so high esteem amongst them. There is not in the whole universe anything worthy of renown which that divine country, i.e. Greece, did not once produce in the height of its excellency. Let us not then forsake the paths that these excellent guides have traced before us, but pursue their footsteps and generously avow that few gallant things which have yet reached down to us are due only as derived from them. For my part, I find so excellent and particular a beauty in the three Greek orders that I am hardly at all concerned with the other two of Latin comparison. Frère was an extremely influential author on architecture in this period, and especially in England, where this book was read for many, many years after his death. And this idea that the original three orders had been not only created by the Greeks, the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian, but were superior to the two orders the Renaissance had later assigned to Roman invention, the Tuscan and the Composite, and that's what he means here by the Latin. They, for Frère, were corruptions of the three purer orders. And this idea had a huge amount of traction in architectural theory well into the 18th century. But I've pulled out another line from Frère here as well that hints at something important. Frère, whilst talking actually about Doric, the Doric order, notes that on the island of Delos built another very famous Doric temple to the god Apollo in memory of his birth in that place, and of which to this day some vestiges are remaining. By Frère's time, writing 100 years after Serlio, there were reports beginning to creep into Western Europe that perhaps some of those wondrous works of the Greeks with their supposedly pure original orders might survive after all. Indeed, I think by the time Frère wrote these words, Greek architecture in Western Europe was increasingly becoming that classic Rumsfeldian category, the known unknown. It was known to be out there, but its actual nature remained at this point something of a mystery. So 17th century writers were aware that Greek and Roman buildings might differ, and that that difference principally manifested itself in one of quality. The Greeks were better architects than the Romans, who represented a decline in standards since classical Greece. And by the mid-17th century, there was an awareness that evidence for this might lie within the boundaries of an empire that was increasingly becoming more accessible to Western visitors. Sorry. At this point, a couple of decades after Frère wrote these words, enter the travelers. So beginning in the 1670s, a significant number of French and English travelers entered Ottoman Greece and Asia Minor, saw ancient ruins, and wrote accounts of them. I'll start with these three. One Englishman, George Wheeler, in the middle here, his French traveling companion, Jacob Spon, to his left, and the slightly later French traveler, Joseph Piton de Tournefort. Before we see their accounts, it must be stated that none of these travelers entered Greece solely to look at architecture. They had numerous interests beyond that subject. Indeed, all three, and Tournefort in particular, were avid botanists, and they tended to prioritize flora and fauna over ruins. They also, like all travel writers in this period, obsessively recorded the habits and customs of local people, often at the expense of devoting time to recording what survived of the ancient world. Nonetheless, all three do have much to say on antiquity. Spon and Wheeler visited Athens, and their accounts of the city and its acropolis are the first detailed ones by Western Europeans. All three travelled in the Aegean archipelago and visited Delos, and they all toured the eastern coast of Asia Minor and found their way to Ephesus and other Greek and Roman sites there. So, what did these three say upon encountering Freya's known unknown? Most of the time, I would say, their accounts seem to merely confirm what they might have thought prior to arriving in Greece, that ancient Greek architecture was really, really good. Wheeler's account of the Parthenon, which he saw, it's important to remember he saw it before the 1687 explosion, is fairly typical in this respect. The Temple of Minerva, as he calls it, the chief goddess of the Athenians, is not only still the chief ornament of the citadel, but absolutely both for matter and art, the most beautiful piece of antiquity remaining in the world. He continues, it is situated about the middle of the citadel and consists altogether of admirable white marble. The plain above it is twice as long, 98 foot 6 inches broad. It has an ascent every way of 5 degrees or steps, and seems to be so contrived so as to serve a basis to the portico, which is supported by channel pillars of the Doric order, erected around upon them without any bases. So we are told of its beauty. We're given the basics of its architecture. We're given its dimensions, which are large, and Wheeler will also comment in his account on the bigness of this temple. He'll also, like all authors prior to 1687, comment on how intact it was. But at no point here, whilst Wheeler notes the fact that the columns of the Parthenon are fluted or channeled, as he puts it, and without bases, two features that we would now recognize as being essential to the 5th century Greek Doric order. He at no point here suggests that he sees this form of the Doric as being in any way different to the Roman, or that recorded by Vitruvius, which now, of course, we would. Likewise, other authors seem to have gone to Greece with a preconceived idea of what its architecture might look like, and that idea involves it looking beautiful and, importantly, simple or noble, as Freya had already predicted. Here is Freya's countryman, 24, on Naxos, encountering the Temple of Apollo. He says, about a musket shot from the island near the castle rises out a little rock on which is seen a very beautiful gate of marble, which consists of but 3 pieces of white marble. It is remarkably noble in its simplicity. 2 pieces form the mounters and the 3rd the lintel. Again, this doesn't really tell us much about this building beyond its simplicity and its beauty. And Tournefort makes no effort to try to date this structure. It is, in fact, from the mid-6th century BC, so it's pretty old. Here's Tournefort again on the nearby island of Delos, encountering some arches. In this case, I've worked out that he's looking at these, the arches from the gymnasium at Delos that have in the 20th century been reconstructed somewhat. Here he sees more noble workmanship. Molds are of one single square piece, 5 foot diameter, cut semicircular, broad in the clear 3 foot 4 inches, with moldings of a noble simplicity. So like Wheeler, he comes to Greece and sees the noble beauty that perhaps he was expecting to see. But here I think we begin to see the limitations of how these travelers record these buildings. For Tournefort here uses the same language to describe 2 buildings with completely different functions that were built probably 400 years apart. Tournefort doesn't actually say what kind of building he thought these arches came from, and for what it's worth, Spon and Wheeler thought this was a temple. It is actually a late Hellenistic gymnasium. And this brings us to the key question of dating. When it comes to dating ancient structures, travelers in this period used 3 different kinds of sources. Firstly, ancient authors such as Pausanias and Strabo, whose accounts are not always clear, to say the least. They used, secondly, local guides, the importance of which in early accounts of Greece, I'm only myself just beginning to realize, actually. I need to think more about that in this research. And thirdly, inscriptions on the buildings themselves, which tended to be the most reliable source. But all of these brought problems and all got travelers into trouble when it came to chronology. So before I go on to suggest that in some respects the accounts of Greek architecture prior to Leroy, Stuart and Rever are more sophisticated than had previously been thought, it's time to acknowledge just how chaotic and error-laden they can be, especially when it came to chronology and the potential differences between the architecture of differing periods in the ancient world, especially between that and the Greek and Romans. In other words, it's time now for the early travellers to Greece architectural blooper reel. So, Spon and Wheeler couldn't decide which of these was the proper layer. Pausanias describes the proper layer as follows. There is but one entry to the Acropolis, he tells us. The gateway, proper layer, has a roof of white marble, and down to the present day, it is unrivaled for its beauty and size of stones. Well, the 3rd century Beaulieu Gate was clearly an entrance, even if we know it was built 700 years later. Whereas the building on the right here matched Pausanias' descriptions of the proper layer as being unrivaled for beauty and size of its stones, even if it wasn't in their day, and indeed today, not quite clearly the gateway that the Beaulieu Gate is. In the end, Spon and Wheeler opted for the latter and got it right. But Pausanias' words here continued to cause trouble. Over 50 years later, the English traveller Charles Perry would leave the Acropolis in 1740, completely convinced that the Beaulieu Gate was the proper layer. Continuing, Spon and Wheeler both thought that the western pediment frieze of the Parthenon dated from the Hadrianic period. They noted this because, I hope you can see my mouse pointer here. I can do this. They thought this because they noted that the bearded man here in the sculpture looked like the Roman emperor who had done so much to restore Athens, and the woman sitting next to him happened to resemble his consort, the Empress Sabina, as well. In fact, Wheeler in particular flirted with the idea that this indicated that the entire colonnade of the temple, i.e. everything but the cella, may have dated from the Roman period as well. To continue, so moving on, all visitors to the Acropolis, including even Leroy, Stewart and Revet themselves, assume that the 2nd century AD Odeon, how do I get rid of this annotation? Excuse me, sorry, I should not have done that. Oh, clear. All right, I'm not going to do that again. I hope you can see my mouse cursor. Moving on, all visitors to the Acropolis, up to including Leroy, Stewart and Revet, thought that the 2nd century AD Odeon and Paradis Atticus, built in the Roman period, was in fact the Greek theatre of Dionysus that Pausanias made reference to being on the south slopes of the Acropolis. The real one here on the left would turn up in the 19th century, having been buried for millennia, at which point it was realized that the structure on the right was so much later. And to our eyes, I think this mistake really does suggest an unawareness of the fundamental forms of Greek architecture and a profound inability to distinguish between the brick and ashlar arches of Roman construction and the open-air theatres of the Greek world. As does this, I think, back to Tournefort stumbling his way around the island of Delos, where he decided, based on the sheer number of pieces of marble that now litter the area that he knew indeed was once the famous sanctuary of Apollo, that the temple in question must have been an enormous domed structure. In fact, he was looking at the remains of at least 3 separate temples here. Had he known this, he probably wouldn't have tried to turn the whole area into a huge 5th century Greek version of the Roman Pantheon. And maybe if there's time later, I'll tell you the full story of Tournefort's account of this, which goes into, like, he gets completely muddled up, puts the Colossus of the Naxians on top of the temple and all sorts of silly things. Moving on, in Asia Minor, no other building can cause as much chronological chaos as the legendary Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, known to all early modern writers through the account given by Pliny. When Spon, Wheeler, and subsequently Tournefort were taken to the site by local guides, they were shown the ruins of the great structure near the ancient harbour. When the actual temple was excavated in the 19th century, incidentally over a mile away to the east, it was realized that the ruins that early travelers had all assumed as being those of the Artemisian were in fact those of the harbour gymnasium and bath complex, which we see here, built during the reign of the Roman Emperor Domitian at the end of the 1st century AD. This acceptance of local guides' claims led to a belief that major temples of the Hellenistic period, for that is when Pliny dated the Temple of Artemis to, in Asia Minor, all featured brick and ashlar vaulting in their basements. And this mistake then subsequently infected travellers' understandings of other sites. So here is Wheeler amongst the ruins of the Hellenistic and Roman site of Alexandria, Troas in the Triad. He thinks, says Wheeler, that something resembles the form of the temple of Diana at Ephesus. That this is something resembling the form of the temple of Diana at Ephesus, of which more hereafter. Indeed, their forms so well resembling one another, and the pieces of arches remain consisting of brick and stone that seem to have been covered within some metal by the holes which yet remain orderly in rows for some such purpose, assuring me that the building is not modern, incline me much to be of the opinion that both are the remains of the temples of Diana. Wheeler was right in thinking that these buildings look very similar, because in both cases he was looking at Roman gymnasia and thermae. And this mistake just kept coming back to bite describers of ancient buildings in the region, as every time they saw something that vaguely looked like the Temple of Diana at Ephesus, aka the Harbour Gymnasium, they assumed it was the foundations of a Greek temple rather than a Roman civic building. So here, sorry, that date is wrong. I don't know why that says 1682. This is Richard Pocock writing in the 1740s. So, you know, a good 80 years after Spon and Wheeler first see the Harbour Gymnasium. I think it's the Temple of Artemis. Pocock visits Aphrodisias in Asia Minor, having been in Ephesus the month before. He saw a building which he thought was the Temple of Aphrodite. To the northwest of this hill are the remains of a building which I take to have been a temple built to Aphrodisia or Venus, and from this place might have taken its name. And I can collect it from an inscription that there was some goddess particularly worshipped here. This temple is built something after the manner of that at Ephesus, here we go again, with large piers of hewn stone on which it is probable arches were turned, and by holes in the stones the building appears to have been cased in marble. It may be concluded from some remains near that the building was of the Corinthian order. Again, there's a reason why this structure looks like what he thought was the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus. It's a Roman bathhouse from the Hadrianic period. Ironically, Pocock would then go on to describe the actual temple of Aphrodite at Aphrodisias, but describe it as a temple to Dionysus on the basis of a relief carving with a vine leaf, which he saw amongst the ruins. And finally, in this case of constantly repeating bad penny of a mistake, it found its way back home and into contemporary writings on ancient architecture by architects and architectural theorists rather than travellers. Here's Christopher Wren, no less, under the impression that the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus had vaults. This was due to his reading of Spon and Wheeler's accounts. So Wren says, writing just around the turn of the 18th century, modern travellers tell us there are great heaps of ruin to this day and large vaults, which probably were the substructions of the colonnades. So here's Wren's plan of the Artemisian Ephesus, and he's telling us that he thinks that these are probably built under there. Okay, I shall just show a blank page now while I move on. But having given you a flavour of the mistakes that these travellers made, and those mistakes were manifold, I've only given you a little taste of them. I want to spend the rest of this paper identifying moments where not only did they get things right, but they identified moments in ancient Greek architecture which hinted at a much bigger, more profound story. That of the creation of a canon of ancient stylistic development, a story that has traditionally always begun with Leroy, Stewart, and Revert. So far, I've mainly concentrated on Wheeler and Tournefort. Of the three travellers I've discussed so far, though, it was Jacob Spon who showed the most sensitivity towards the appearance of ancient architecture and what that could tell him about its origins and potentially its development. Here is Spon, alongside Wheeler, engaging in some dating of a major Athenian monument, the Choragic monument of Isocrates, known to all travellers in this period as the Lantern of Demosthenes, due to an erroneous belief that its construction had been brought about by the great orator and that it looked like a lantern. As both Spon and Wheeler observe, if it had been built by Demosthenes, then that would date it to the 4th century BC. However, even if, as they also speculated, the role of Demosthenes in its construction was a modern fabrication, an inscription on the monument itself pointed to a date during his lifetime. Here's Wheeler at the top, noting that the archon the inscription referred to lived in the mid-4th century. So, says Wheeler, this place must needs be very ancient, for Eunatus was archon in the 2nd year of the 111th Olympiad, which answers to the 418th year of Rome's foundation and was 330 years before Christ's incarnation, that is 2013 years since. Thus, noted Wheeler, the monuments seem to comfortably date from around 430 BC. Wheeler leaves it there. Spon, on the other hand, uses this date to establish a fact about the development of a particular feature used in ancient built form, the fluting of columns, or the channeling of pillars, as it was generally known in the 17th century. So here's Spon thinking about this. He says, as I had said in the relation of Athens printed before my trip, by which he means a publication that he'd written prior to going to Athens, I'd noted that fluted columns were not older than the time of the Roman emperors, and therefore these could not be from the time of Demosthenes. But I was deceived by a passage that I had been told in Vitruvius, though in fact he makes no mention of it. I have since recognized through my travels that fluted columns are of the oldest antiquity. So says Spon, he had been under the impression that the fluting of columns began only in the Roman imperial period, but here was seemingly conclusive evidence of it being a much older practice. And this is a nice example, I think, of the empirical dating of an ancient architectural feature a good 80 years before the Roy. Likewise, and perhaps even more interesting, is Spon's reaction to this building. As Western European knowledge of the temples of southern Italy and Sicily remains extremely limited in the late 17th century, and indeed well into the 18th century, the Temple of Apollo at Corinth was really the only properly archaic building that writers on Greek architecture and travelers really encountered in this period. As a result of this unfamiliarity, all visitors to the site, Wheeler included, noted its strange proportions. Wheeler, for example, commented on the fact that the proportions of the Doric columns here at Corinth were much squatter than those of the great temples of Athens. But once again, he left it there. Spon, on the other hand, upon seeing this temple, dipped his toe into the waters of the stylistic dating of ancient architecture, waters that have traditionally been seen as only occupied by the writers of the 1750s and beyond. So these columns, to me, said Spon, seemed the most ancient than any I have ever seen because of their extraordinary proportion. Because although they are of the Doric order, they do not have the same proportion as the others in Athens and elsewhere. Pliny says the Doric order must be 6 times as high as the diameter of the foot of the column, yet these are not 4 times as large. Spon doesn't take it any further than that, but he seems convinced, and he says he thought this due to the proportional discrepancy between this and the Doric temples of Athens and indeed the account in Pliny. This then, I think, is evidence of a desire to date the buildings of ancient Greece, or crucially, to do it stylistically. We also find in accounts of ancient Greek architecture from the late 17th century a recognition that perhaps some of the details of the buildings that were comfortably from what we now call the classical Greek period might differ from those that came after them. Here's a minor example from Wheeler of a potentially strange goings-on in the minutiae of the 5th century Ionic order. In his description of the Ionic capitals of the Erechtheion, Wheeler reveals that he had never seen an example of this order with this band of relief carved Anthemian motifs running around the column directly under the capital, this thing here, if you can see my nice pointer. The roof, says Wheeler, is sustained by Ionic pillars, channeled, but the chapters, which is the word he uses to mean the capitals, are something different from any I have seen of that order, and seem to be a kind of mixture of it, between it and the Doric order. Comparing the Erechtheion capital to Roman examples of the Doric and Ionic orders, here from the Baths of Diocletian at the top and the Temple of Fortuna Virilis beneath, both of which Wheeler would have seen because he'd been to Rome, we can see what he means. And in the process, we can identify in Wheeler perhaps a familiarity with Greek architectural form that sometimes perhaps meant he could identify discrepancies between it and the Greek. But there is one travel from this period that really began to analyze carefully the details of ancient Greek buildings, and perhaps really begin to differentiate between them and his knowledge of Roman examples. I'll now turn for the rest of this paper to Francis Vernon, who I've published on before, and no doubt will continue to publish on because he fascinates me. Francis Vernon was an English traveller who journeyed to Greece with Spon and Wheeler, but went his separate way once he got there. He reached Athens before them and spent several months in the city before travelling through Asia Minor, down the Black Sea coast and into Persia. He was murdered in 1677 in Isfahan, and unlike Spon, Wheeler, and Tournefort, never got to return and publish a major account of his travels, though he tells us in a letter that it was his plan to do that had he returned. Instead, all we have of Vernon's time in Athens are the following: his signature, which I show here on the inner wall of the cella of the Temple of Hephaestus, which he wrote in 1675, and my many thanks to Sylvie Dumont from the American School for arranging access for me to this building last week and helping me find this. Secondly, a brief letter that he wrote back to England, which was published in the Philosophical Transactions, the Journal of the Royal Society. And I've written a lot in print already about this letter, so I'm not going to discuss it today, but it's in my book and another article I published on Vernon if you want to know more. And finally, he also left us his travel journal, which somehow made it back to London and now survives in the Royal Society's library, and I show you an image of it on the left. The journal is a remarkable account of everyday life in Ottoman Greece, and it also shows that Vernon was a traveller with a very great interest in ancient architecture. Indeed, Spon, who, as I said, travelled with Vernon for a while, called Vernon a mathematician and an architect. And here Spon's using the broader late 17th century use of that term, architect, to mean not just people who designed buildings, but people who wrote about them and studied them as well. And so in his journal, he gives us something that Spon, Wheeler, and Tournefort never do. He gives us the specific plans of ancient buildings, albeit sketchy ones. This is the on the bottom here is the propylaea. This is the erect theon which Vernon makes symmetrical because he never actually saw the caryatid porch. So he assumed that there was another porch that matched the northern porch on the other side, so he bangs that on. If you want to know more about that, that's in an article I wrote. Vernon also differed from other travellers in this period due to his tendency to use Vitruvius in his analysis of ancient architecture, rather than Pausanias, Strabo, or Pliny. And in his journal, he reveals that whilst in Athens, he not only read Vitruvius almost every day, but that he seems to have catered his reading of the Roman text around specific visits to ancient buildings. So, for example, on the morning of the 4th of November 1675, whilst in the city, he read the 4th book of Vitruve, which happens to include the account of the Doric order, and then he spent the afternoon looking at the Doric temple on the Agora, the Doric temple of Hephaestus. On the 6th of November, Vernon recorded that he had read Vitruvius's 5th book, Theatris, in the morning, and then he walked out to see Theatre of Bacchus, which he, like everybody else, thought he was actually referring to the Odeon of Herodes Atticus, not the Temple of Dionysus, sorry, the Theatre of Dionysus, but that's by the by. As a result of this, his analysis of the ancient ruins of the city was focused, architecturally focused, careful, and importantly, fundamentally informed by his knowledge of the Vitruvian rules of Roman architecture. And subsequently, I think he was able to spot discrepancies in built form between the temples of Athens and Rome that not even Spon saw. Take this small example, again relating to the capitals of the erect theon, and in particular, those in the corners of the porticos. This is typical Vernon language. I'm afraid there's going to be a lot of architectural terminology coming up, but I'll do my best to explain it. He says the ear of the voluta, which he means this, it was in the corner, which was in the corner was cut in two, and all the sections of the voluta appeared in each. This might not seem like much and might seem a bit confusing, but what Vernon is describing here, I think, is the strange effect that one finds on the corner capitals of Greek Ionic porticos, where that's what I'm talking about, where the two volutes sort of crash into each other on the inner angle of the capital. You can see this strangeness here in the erect theon today. Now, the Romans sometimes used this form of corner Ionic capital as well. You can find these actually on the Temple of Fortuna Virilis. But they tended instead to position 4 volutes at 45 degrees around the capital in order to prevent this strange collision. You can see them doing that, so here on the Temple of Saturn in Rome. Thus creating a more satisfactory corner Ionic that the Renaissance would indeed almost exclusively use. You don't find much of this going on in the Renaissance because the Roman solution is better. But also, importantly, Vitruvius, in his account of the Ionic order, does not mention how to handle the corner volutes and says nothing about the problem that Vernon has identified here in the erect Theon. Let's move to the Parthenon and see a better example of Vernon's analysis at work. Here is his description of the corner of the Parthenon. I should do my best to translate architectural terms here. Vernon has a tendency to use Italian architectural terms. So over the comatium of the triglyphi, by which he means this, the cornice, should come the sophita of the cornice plane, but 18 giocchioli graven onto it. So what he means here, these little blobs here are the giocchioli or guttae that should be engraved onto the flat surface of the cornice. And note that he keeps saying should here. But these giocchioli on the Parthenon are done on plain tablets some 3 inches deep, which shoot out under the sophita of the cornice after the manner of pedillions and their spal. This is a very complicated way of saying that these blocks here, what we would call the mutuals, or drop down from the cornice of the Parthenon and indeed every other Greek Doric temple. They look like Lego blocks. I'm talking about these blocks of Lego that hang down. In other words, the cornice of the Parthenon was different from Roman Doric temples because its mutuals and guttae were articulated on clearly defined tablets some 3 inches deep and after the manner of modillions, and modillions are architectural features that hang down, rather than being flush with the soffit, as should have been the case, according to Vitruvius. And indeed, if we look in the edition of Vitruvius that I am 100% sure that Vernon was using when in Athens, he was using an Italian translation of 1556 by Daniel Barbaro. We see an illustration of the Doric order in which you can see here where you can see the little the guttae, these little blobs, are cut up into the cornice. There's no hint of this dropping down of these Lego blocks. So we see this in the illustration of the Doric order in this Vitruvius edition, and indeed in other Renaissance Vitruvius editions. Flat mutuals cut up, incised into the soffit of the building, whereas here, as Vernon say, they shoot out. Vernon went on then to note the same arrangement with clearly defined mutuals that drop down from the cornice could also be found on the Doric orders of the Propylaea, here above, and the temple of Hephaestus on the left here. Continuing with Vernon, he also identified, I think, perhaps the most characteristic feature of Greek Doric temples, and the reason why they ultimately feel so different from Roman buildings: the power of their baseless fluted Doric shafts. Here is his account of the Parthenon's columns. He says these pillars are of Doric order, but have no base at all. The fustio, and what he means by fustio, he means the shaft of the column, riseth immediately out of the pavement as if it grew. On the top, the capitello, by which he means the capital, hath only the abaco ovolo, by which he means this sort of spongy cushion thing, and aminelli, the little line underneath it, without any collarino, as we'll see. Roman Dorics tend to have another little band underneath that. Immediately under the aminelli begins the gimbia of the pillar, by which he means, again, the main shaft. Vernon here seems to note with genuine surprise how the columns of the Parthenon seem to grow out of the ground. But rather than just see this as a metaphor, I think it reveals that Vernon saw how very different these columns were to Roman Doric columns, which he had also, like Wheeler and Spon indeed, had seen firsthand in Rome a few years earlier, and which either had bases or lacked the dramatic tree trunk-like power of the 5th century Greek Doric. Here is a baseless Doric column from the Theatre Marcellus, which I think it's fair to say does not have that sort of tree-like growing out of the pavement. And here is a Renaissance illustration, a standard Renaissance Doric column with a base sitting on the bottom of While he was at it in this account, he noted, as I've said, that the top of the capitals diverged from, sorry, the top of the columns between the capitals diverged from the Roman norm as well. They lack the necking, colorino and Vernon's words that we can see here in the Roman Doric stage, in the Greek Doric is missing. Roman Doric often really always possessed this, and which editions of Vitruvius from the period always illustrated. So what we see in Vernon's travel journal is an attempt to establish moments in the architecture of the temples of Athens where their details differed from Vitruvius and from Rome. Alas, though, these tantalizing glances of an architecturally attuned mind at work on the Acropolis in 1675 is all we have from Vernon. His death meant that the journal, his field notes essentially, are all that survives. Had he returned safely and published an account of his travels in Greece, I'm fairly sure that it would have included more architectural discussion in Spon, Wheeler and Tournefort. It may also have included plans of the buildings of Athens, and perhaps, if I may be allowed to speculate, it might have opened up a discussion of the differences between ancient Greek architecture and that of Vitruvius and Rome, in a way that those three published authors never did. To conclude then, let's return to the dawn of the Greek revival. As I hope is shown in this paper, despite all its mistakes, the lack of chronology and a general unawareness, with few exceptions, of what made ancient Greek architecture unique, the idea that Stuart and Revett and Leroy represented a complete thunderbolt from the blue when it came to the Western European understanding of ancient Greek architecture can at least be nuanced, if not questioned. What we see in Spon's attempts to get some grasp of the dates of the development of ancient architecture, and in Vernon's attempt to disentangle Greek form from the Vitruvian Roman norm, is the very beginnings, I think, of the themes that would go on to make Leroy and Stuart and Revett's texts so very famous. These themes are firstly the identification of a chronology of stylistic development in the ancient world, both between the Roman and the Greek, and within the Greek itself, a process that Leroy is generally credited with starting, and in doing so, using incidentally as one of his key sources the Temple of Apollo at Corinth, which had prompted Spon to speculate on Greek stylistic development 80 years earlier. And secondly, the recognition that the Greek handling of the orders was in many respects different from that of the Romans, a realization that Vernon may have made in his detailed analysis of the Parthenon, but one that wouldn't reach full fruition until the 1750s. So I think that in these moments we see that Leroy and Stuart and Revett, whilst of enormous significance, should not be viewed in isolation. They were following in the footsteps of others, and they built upon the ideas of others. And whilst those others, to us at least, seem to hold such inchoate ideas about ancient Greek architecture, they did occasionally ask the same questions that the authors of the 1750s asked, and in the case of the authors of the 1750s in answering, supposedly begun the Greek revival. But actually, I don't quite want to conclude here. I want to really quickly return to Western European architecture, which is my principal area of investigation in all of this. Where does all this leave Hawksmoor and his temple with its supposedly Greek features? Well, this is the question I'm going to deal with at length in the book that will emerge from this research project and my time here in Athens. And I don't know yet the answer to what Hawksmoor and his architectural contemporaries really meant when they described something as Greek. But one thing I will say is this, that until the detailed measured illustrations of Greek buildings arrived into England and France in the late 1750s, no architect could really design a building with genuinely accurate Greek features. Hawksmoor's temple remains decidedly un-Greek, because without those detailed measured drawings that Leroy, Stuart and Revett would produce, the translation of the knowledge of Greek architecture into actual design was not possible. And neither did the published accounts provide enough detail for an architect to really try to experiment with Greek form, as exciting as Spon's revelation at Corinth and Vernon's attempts to analyze the Parthenon through Vitruvius might have been. But architecture does not ultimately exist in printed accounts nor in field notes, no matter how architecturally sensitive they might be. It exists visually and in the build. So until the late 1750s, an accurately sourced Greek revival remained impossible. Thank you.